There's one road that. Sorry, this might be actually a different one, but. He said he has it in a route, so all I can do is send it to you for it.
Okay, sweet, thanks, yeah.
It's kind of like,
I'll be right back. Oh,
it's kind of like, okay, so like. It's kind of like these roads, like, so Carter Lake is really good, so there's a bunch of roads back there too. It's this road, you take the Masonville and then down into, so this is Stove Prairie Road. So I don't know if this is considered Stove Prairie Road here, but you can take it all the way up into the Prairie Canyon and then come down, or you can cut in the south side of Horseshoe, and this is a really pretty section too.
Yeah, going south.
So even one more.
It's good road biking too, like road biking.
Hi, Kyra, do you hear us? Cool. We're gonna start in 1 moment. It's good to get started, right? All right, I think it's good time to start, yeah. Hi, thank you all for joining for the EDS seminar today. Please join me to welcome our guest speaker, Dr. Kyra Clark-Wolf. Dr. Clark-Wolf is a postdoctoral associate at Series to NS-CASC. She studies ecological transformation under climate change and disturbance regimes. Especially in her research, she integrates paleoecology, phyecology, and ecosystem ecology, aiming to develop ecological scenarios for natural resource management using wide framework. She earned her BA in environmental science from Colorado College and her PhD in systems ecology from the University of Montana. She currently lives in Logan, Utah, and enjoys hiking, baking, and botanizing in her free times. Thank you, Kyra, for joining us today, and the floor is yours.
Awesome. Thanks, Nanny. Let me just get my screen shared here. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Okay. Slides look okay?
Yes.
Good. Okay, great. Yeah, thanks so much for having me here today and for joining. And thanks, Nanny, for the invitation to speak in this seminar series. I'm excited to share about sort of a few different aspects of my work. So this might be a little bit of an eclectic talk, but I'm going to try my best to kind of tie it all together. And just to give a tiny bit of background on who I am as a scientist and a relatively new member of Series. I've spent all of my research career in the Rockies, mainly studying interactions among climate, wildfire, and forest ecosystems, both in my undergraduate work, studying soil biogeochemistry following fires at Colorado College, and at the University of Montana, where I used paleoecological methods to reconstruct past changes in fire activity and forest responses. And I joined the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center here in Ceres a little over a year ago, although I live in Logan, Utah, as Nanny mentioned. And if you're not familiar with our center, we work cooperatively with USGS and a consortium of institutions within our region, spanning the 7 states shown here, to provide integrative, multidisciplinary science and science translation to support climate adaptation work among a range of partners, including state and federal agencies and tribes. And so today I'm going to touch on a little bit of both my dissertation work and my postdoctoral work as well. And so starting broad here, kind of all of my research falls under this big question of understanding how ecological systems respond to environmental change across a range of spatial and temporal scales. And this is particularly important today in which ecosystems are increasingly at risk of transformation due to the effects of directional climate change, anthropogenic stressors, and increased frequency and intensity of natural disturbances like wildfires, droughts, heat waves, etc. And a key question here is understanding under what conditions ecological resilience may be overcome. We think of a resilient system as one that is dynamic or potentially fluctuating through time, but retains some fundamental set of organizing characteristics and self-reinforcing feedbacks, such that it can be perturbed, but remain within the same overall state. This is often visualized using a ball and cup diagram like this, where the ball is kind of the current condition of the system, and it can kind of move around through time, but tends to kind of roll back down and stay within the same overall basin of attraction. And resilience is typically maintained when disturbance and environmental context are well aligned with species traits. However, when these external drivers change faster than the community can respond, the system can shift to a new state, for example, from a forest to a non-forest or a different forest type. And this is thought of as ecological transformation. And understanding the bounds of ecological resilience provides insights into how ecological systems may respond in a changing climate. Indeed, we have seen large transformations in the past. The large temperature changes following the last ice age were associated with substantial shifts in species composition and structure across global biomes, suggesting that natural resource managers need to plan for a future that may look very different from today as we move more into unfamiliar conditions into the future. And this really calls for a focus on climate adaptation, which provides a lens through which traditional approaches and practices in natural resource management focused on maintaining or restoring historical or natural conditions can be adjusted to account for the effects of current or expected future climate change. And in the face of anticipated ecosystem transformations, resource stewards can choose to resist those changes, accept them, or actively direct change towards more desirable outcomes. This is summarized nicely using the resist, accept, and direct framework, which has gained a lot of attention in recent years. And these choices depend both on the probability of transformation and the acceptability of those transformations. This acceptability piece really sits in the realm of social science, understanding the human values and attitudes that shape our decisions about how to respond to changing conditions. But my work really focuses on the natural science component of helping assess the risk and the nature of potential ecological change, which itself is not trivial, due in part to uncertainty in the nature and pace of future climate change, and in part to uncertainty in how ecological systems may respond to a particular change in climate, where we can see the range of global and northern hemisphere temperatures and precipitation we might expect in coming decades, showing increasing uncertainty into the future from emission scenarios, model variability, and natural variability. And what this translates to in terms of impacts to different ecosystem processes or components like wildfire, tree mortality, carbon loss, etc., similarly has a high degree of uncertainty. Whereas we move further away from current climate conditions, the level of risk or impact tends to increase, shown by these darker colors, while the confidence in those impacts, shown by the dots on the right, tends to decrease. And so this growing uncertainty as we move more and more into unfamiliar or dissimilar conditions, climate conditions, makes it challenging to anticipate ecosystem changes on timescales of years to decades, most relevant to management planning. And my work aims to shed light on this challenge by characterizing past changes in ecosystem dynamics and providing support for climate adaptation under uncertainty. And in particular, I argue that paleoecological data fill a key knowledge gap by representing ecosystem responses to climatic variation and change over timescales of decades to millennia, thus capturing a wider range of variation in environmental conditions, and representing long-term ecosystem dynamics in which slow processes, often not well captured by contemporary observational data, can unfold, such as species migration, community turnover, and disturbance regime change. And this can be used to characterize ecological resilience or transformation in the past, can provide context for the magnitude and the pace of contemporary changes relative to historical variability that we're seeing on landscapes today, and can thus help anticipate the potential for future change. And so today, I want to start off by sharing a little bit of my dissertation work, exploring fire-climate ecosystem interactions over millennia to kind of demonstrate the applicability of these types of paleoecological data to understanding the potential impacts of climate change today and supporting climate adaptation. And then I want to transition to discussing some of my in-progress work in the NC-CASC, discussing scenario-based approaches to climate adaptation planning and trying to kind of tie these together under this broad umbrella of climate adaptation. And starting in the past here, my dissertation work primarily centered on mixed conifer and subalpine forests of the northern and southern Rocky Mountains. These are landscapes typically with large amounts of standing biomass, where fires are relatively infrequent and are limited primarily by climatic aridity. So as the climate gets warmer and drier, we tend to see increasing fire activity in these types of systems. And that's exactly what we've been seeing over the past several decades, with much larger areas burned in these types of montane forested environments. And so my research question here was really, are these contemporary fire regime changes that we're starting to see in these systems really beyond the bounds of historical variability, representing the conditions that these forests have experienced in the past and may be able to cope with sort of within the realm of what constitutes resilience for them. And just as a quick sort of terminological note here, when I'm talking about a fire regime, I mean the typical characteristics of fires in terms of frequency, intensity, severity, etc., in a particular area averaged over time. So kind of equivalent to how we think of climate as a long-term average of weather. The fire regime is sort of a long-term average of fire characteristics for a particular ecosystem. And we may expect that as historical fire regimes are exceeded, that we might start to see a loss of resilience in ecosystem processes. And so the dissertation work that I want to present today was part of a large interdisciplinary effort involving multiple institutions and just a whole slew of different research assistants and undergrads who contributed to this work. This type of research is very much a team effort. It involves a lot of time hiking out to kind of remote lakes to collect these sediment cores, which we use as natural archives. And I'm showing mostly these kind of nice field photos here. Rest assured that all of this was followed by many hundreds of hours in the lab processing and analyzing these cores as well. So kind of quick acknowledgement to everyone who contributed to this work. And it might seem a little bit counterintuitive to use lakes to study fire. But it turns out that lakes provide really useful natural archives because they receive materials from the surrounding watershed and they preserve them in layers that tend to build up over time and are relatively well preserved in kind of the cold, low oxygen, low light environments at the bottoms of lakes. And so we can go in and take a core from those lake bottom sediments and pull it out and slice it up, and it looks something like this in the photo on the left. And we can take this core, there's younger sediments at the top, older sediments at the bottom, and we can section it out into thin sections that each correspond to about 5 to 20 years of time in the past. You can kind of see the scoring on the surface of the core that indicates where those sections will be. And just as a quick side note, the light colored layer that you see is an ash deposit from one of the Mount St. Helens eruptions about 500 years ago. And so from each of those sediment sections, we can pull out different materials that provide proxies for what was happening in and around the lake at the time that that sediment was deposited. Things like tree needles and pollen provide some information about vegetation. Charcoal tells us about fire, and stable isotopes and other elemental analyses can tell us something about the watershed biogeochemistry. And there's been a lot of work done to establish the methods for using these proxies to get at what we're interested in. I'm not going to go into too much detail there. Really today, I'll mostly be focusing on charcoal as a fire proxy. So to reconstruct past changes in fire, we can extract little chunks of charcoal shown in this photo from each of our lake sediment samples. And we can count them to quantify a rate of charcoal accumulation over time. So char on the y-axis is the rate of charcoal accumulation. Time on the x-axis is moving from past to present, from left to right. This particular record extends about 4,800 years in the past. And taking this quantitative analysis, we can statistically identify peaks in charcoal accumulation that correspond to local fire events at this site, shown with the red crosses at the top. And so this is interesting. We can kind of look at the fire history from this one lake site. And I actually have another study kind of zooming in to understand from using multiple different proxies, kind of what were the ecosystem responses to each of those fires over this period of record. But what we're really interested in and what we really want to do here is to be able to compare between this type of historical reconstruction and the current rates of fire activity that we're seeing in these Rocky Mountain landscapes, and provide a long-term context for the changes in fire activity that we're experiencing today. And this is challenging to do with a single record like the one I just showed, because it represents a small sample size with only one fire every 100 years or more. And with that type of record, we can only detect variability in fire frequency on the timescale of millennia, not on the timescale of decades or centuries, which is most relevant to thinking about recent and ongoing fire regime changes on the contemporary landscape. For that, we actually need a whole network of similar fire history records. And so part of the motivation here was the fire season of 2020, which you may remember for those who were in Colorado at that time, that there were some extensive fires that occurred in northern Colorado, including the East Troublesome and Cameron Peak fires, enabled by warm, dry conditions over the preceding months and unseasonable extreme fire weather in October. And we wondered whether these fires, in the context of increasing area burned in recent decades, signaled a shift in the fire regime. So to test that, we drew on a network of published lake sediment fire history records from this region in the Southern Rockies, shown here, where each dot on this map is an individual lake with its own fire history record. And by bringing together these 20 fire history records, we're able to quantify fire activity in the region over the past 2,000 years and compare that to 21st century fire activity from satellite records. So this is showing in red the rate of burning over the past 2,000 years or so, again with present on the right. And we have that compared, just for context, to a Northern Hemisphere temperature reconstruction in gray. And so as you can see, 21st century fire activities Its 21st century temperatures and fire activity far exceeded the historical range of variability. Even during a relatively warm period called the medieval climate anomaly, when there was a high rate of burning in this region. And that's in large part due to the extensive 2020 fire season. And so this really highlights the emergence of a climate-driven shift in fire regimes in the Southern Rockies. But what about the Northern Rockies? We wanted to see whether in similar forests in a different region, we were similarly seeing evidence of human-caused fire regime shifts. And in the Northern Rockies region, fire activity has increased in recent decades, but the record-setting year is still the Big Burn of 1910, which burned across millions of acres, mainly in Idaho and Montana. And these fires are historically important because they set up the national narrative and policy on fire suppression in the 20th century. And we wanted to know whether this type of extensive burning is characteristic of a natural fire regime. And so as in the Southern Rockies, where we drew on published fire histories, we developed a new set of records from 12 lakes in this landscape in the northern Bitterroot Mountains of Idaho and Montana. And we used peaks and charcoal to identify fire events at each individual site, where each of these dots on the map represents an individual charcoal record. And by bringing together the records from all 12 sites, we calculated the percent of sites burned per century, allowing us to estimate the rate of burning across the paleoecological record. And so over the past 2,500 years, fires occurred at a point on this landscape on average every 164 years, more frequently than over the 20th to 21st century, which averaged 215 years. And so contemporary and recent fire activity, including the 1910 fires, is not unprecedented within the context of recent millennia. And so we have these two regions with very different contemporary and historical records. Shown here is the historical rate of burning compared to the 21st century rate, shown using squares in each of these two regions, where the Southern Rockies is kind of this orange color. And so we see that the Southern Rockies are experiencing an emerging shift in the fire regime in contrast to the Northern Rockies, where 21st century fire activity is well within the range of the paleo record. Meaning that in the Northern Rockies, at least, historical resilience has not been exceeded, such that subalpine forests are experiencing fire activity similar to what they've experienced in the past, and they'll likely remain in their current state, at least at present and in the near future. However, both the contemporary and historical records highlight the sensitivity of fire regimes in these regions to climatic aridity, and suggest that burning will increase, in particular when warm, dry climate conditions coincide with extreme fire weather, such as in 1910 or in 2020. And indeed, the occurrences with years with conditions like in 2020 are expected to be much more common under future climate conditions. This is on the left here, an analysis from a recent paper showing predicted extreme fire spread events under reference climate conditions and under a 2C future, where we see that 2020 was really an outlier under these reference conditions, but would not be in future. And so the pace and timing of emerging shifts in historical fire regimes will likely vary regionally, enabled by climate, but catalyzed by exceptional fire events under extreme fire weather. And that has consequences for these subalpine forest ecosystems, where in the Southern Rockies, post-fire tree regeneration is increasingly vulnerable to the combined effects of fire and changing climate. So when might we see similar types of changes in the Northern Rockies? What would it take to push this system really past the historical range of variability, given that it has not been yet? To answer that, we can think about some future scenarios of burning in the Northern Rockies. where even though current fire activity in the 21st century, which is this black dot, is within the range of variability of the past 2,500 years, it would only take the addition of 1 or more years with 1910 level burning on top of the current rate of fire activity to push this system outside of the historical range of variability in the next few decades. And so an extreme fire year like 1910 could herald the emergence of a novel fire regime in the near future, which would have significant implications for ecosystems and society, and would require decisions about how to respond. These could include fire suppression to try to resist fire regime and associated ecosystem changes, which might not always be effective, particularly under the types of extreme fire weather that we're talking about here. This could include also acceptance of change in fire regimes, really requiring efforts to improve community preparedness for extreme fire events, or attempts to direct change through active forest management to promote lower severity, if more frequent fires. And so this example has direct relevance for climate adaptation, but it doesn't fully characterize the ecological implications of what a fire regime shift would really mean in the system, where decisions about management really require some of that ecological information as well. And so shifting gears here, I want to dig in a little bit more to this question of how do we provide relevant information about future ecological change that's most relevant for management planning. And climate adaptation really relies on science and information about the potential impacts of climate change to support management planning, implementation, and evaluation. And specifically, in the face of anticipated changes, resource managers have these choices to resist, accept, or direct, which depends on what the potential ecological transformations may be, really motivating attention on methods for characterizing the range of plausible futures. And one such approach is scenario planning, which has emerged as a way to contend with substantial uncertainty about the future. Rather than focusing on the most probable outcome, as in forecasting, scenario planning recognizes that there may be multiple ways that things could go. And by exploring the full range of responses, we can help support decisions under uncertain and uncontrollable conditions. This really places an emphasis on flexibility, helps avoid maladaptation, and results in adaptation plans that are robust across a range of futures. And can be really additionally important to make sure that we're not missing things and identify proactive strategies needed to avert the most detrimental potential impacts of climate change. And systematic methods exist to represent uncertainty in future climate for the purposes of scenario planning. By selecting climate projections from different GCMs and emissions pathways that capture a wide range of plausible climate futures. The goal of which is to select future scenarios and climate futures that are relevant to management, that are divergent from one another, that are plausible and challenging in that they encourage managers to think creatively about the ways that they manage their systems. And so this is just showing an example of that from a planning process at Wind Cave National Park, which selected 2 kind of relevant climate metrics to the resources that managers were interested in this case, multi-year droughts and a spring moisture index. And each of the dots on this graph are individual future climate projections from different models and emission scenarios. Where they selected these 4 to kind of represent this full range of conditions and use that for planning by translating these climate futures into a set of implications for ecological systems and natural resources managed within the park using a combination of qualitative and quantitative methods. And so this is a process of scenario planning that's proven highly effective. It's fairly widely used. In the past, however, these types of processes have dealt with ecological uncertainty relatively simplistically, not fully accounting for variation in many of the drivers beyond climate alone that can shape ecological responses, such as stochastic events, changing biotic interactions, non-stationarity, and all such. And the complexity of ecological systems and the diversity of these processes are such that multiple ecological outcomes may be possible, even under a single set of future climate conditions. And so there's really a need here for methods of developing scenarios that integrate uncertainty in both climate and in ecological responses, which is really the focus of my current work, helping address this question of how can we characterize the diversity of potential ecological outcomes under a range of future climates while delivering a tractable set of scenarios that can be used to inform management or climate adaptation planning. And so to address this challenge, this is kind of a big question. We at the NC-CASC organized a working group effort with a wide range of academic and agency scientists to really bring our collective experience and expertise together to kind of think through some of these questions about how to develop and deliver ecological scenarios in the best ways to account for uncertainty and to inform adaptation planning. And this was really a team science approach premised on the idea that we would be able to sort of more thoroughly explore the potential space of methodologies and come up with better ideas as a collective group than any one of us could individually. And so this is a group I've been engaging with over the past year or so. We had an in-person workshop at CU Boulder in July of last year. That's what this photo is showing. And we've also had a number of virtual engagements both before and following that workshop. And in this group, through a lot of discussion and sort of development of ideas, we've kind of coalesced around 3 key elements that are critical for ecological scenarios. First, a careful consideration of the different processes and drivers that shape ecological system dynamics, focusing on those that are most influential and uncertain, really with transparency about what processes and assumptions are included in scenario development. Second, characterizing trajectories of change over time, rather than simply focusing on ecological outcomes or end states. And really, this is premised on the idea that managers need to know what the ecosystem could look like in 30 or 50 or 100 years, but also what they might see in the meantime, what triggers could lead to abrupt changes in ecosystem dynamics, and what levers they might have to shape those outcomes. And this focus on trajectories really shifts attention to consider in more detail the mechanisms of transformation and the pathways through which changes could unfold on these intermediate to long time horizons that are really relevant for management planning. And lastly, a recognition here that we may face some unexpected outcomes, and that it's really valuable to explicitly consider the bounds of plausibility and seek out some of the more extreme possibilities that could arise under novel future conditions to support adaptation planning that comprehensively considers risks and improves preparedness for the most consequential contingencies, rather than simply focusing on the most likely outcomes. And so we summarized this thinking into kind of a very generic workflow for developing ecological scenarios that can be integrated into adaptation planning processes, involving problem framing, selecting critical drivers that shape ecological responses, including climate, but also disturbance regimes and other anthropogenic stressors, exploring the range of ecological responses and trajectories, considering what potential surprises might arise, and finally, synthesizing ecological scenarios into a tractable set that managers can consider and really use these storylines to inform how they evaluate their management objectives and identify potential strategies for climate adaptation. And again, I'm not going to go into too much detail about kind of every component of this workshop. This is meant to provide a really general set of approaches to help guide the development of scenarios and integrate some of these key considerations while remaining flexible to be applicable across a broad range of institutional or decision contexts. And to try to make this a little bit more practicable, we also brainstormed a range of kind of more specific methodologies that could be brought to bear in exploring divergent ecological responses, ranging from specific types of model structures or ways of using ecological models to more kind of qualitative approaches that could be used within the context of a participatory process with local experts and managers. And this set of methods is really flexible to accommodate these types of real-world situations where data or capacity might be limited in terms of bringing in quantitative methodologies here. That qualitative information can be additionally extremely informative. And just to give kind of a couple of examples here, we applied this workflow retrospectively to an existing study of fire-catalyzed vegetation transformations in southwestern dry forests to illustrate elements of this workflow and to try to understand how it could be applied in practice using quantitative data. And I won't go into too much detail, but this study developed correlative models based on field observations of forest community composition change after past fires, and projected using those models forward to a mid-century time horizon under distinct scenarios of a wet and a dry future climate condition and a range of assumptions about future fire severity. And we took those quantitative results shown in this bar plot, kind of in the bottom middle here, and summarized them into a set of 3 ecological scenarios that we used to explore adaptation strategies that would be robust across a range of future conditions and could be informed by vegetation monitoring after future fires. Another example, kind of digging into a little bit more of the relationship between trajectories and ecological outcomes is from the Nebraska Sandhills. We're currently working with folks in the Fish and Wildlife Service in Nebraska who manage national wildlife refuges in the system to develop some future scenarios of climate change impacts for the grasslands there. And this is kind of summarizing our current thinking and understanding of this system, where the historical dynamics and current trends encompass variation from open dune states under a much drier past climate with more frequent droughts to kind of sparser grasslands, even in the early 1900s under higher grazing pressure, to today, what is largely mixed grass prairie with sort of an increasing threat of woody encroachment from largely eastern red cedar in the system. And so we kind of explored under a range of future climate conditions, what might be those probable trajectories of change toward a range of ecological features, ranging from transition more fully into woodlands, to kind of maintenance of mixed grass prairie under particular climate conditions and management regimes, to even a transition back into kind of an open dune devegetated state under the most extreme scenarios of future drought. And while this is a little bit more of a qualitative example, I'll just note that some of this is well supported by different kind of existing projections and resources that we were able to draw from, including dynamic global vegetation model projections, climate analogs showing the plausibility of remaining kind of within a grassland state. And then these paleoecological observations combined with ecosystem modeling, showing the plausibility of kind of this transition back into a devegetated state. And so this is just one case study and one that's still in process. We're kind of continuing to work on refining this in partnership with managers in this system. But we argue that this is not just relevant for kind of adaptation planning, that both adaptation practitioners and environmental scientists and modelers more broadly can benefit from this type of carefully structured scenario thinking. This is not really a new idea, but it's something that I think needs more discussion in global change biology. That in lieu of really reliable predictions about long-term ecological change, scenarios offer us a way to communicate better, give us license to recognize the value in divergent model outputs, and really provide an impetus to focus on understanding temporal dynamics in ecology. And this echoes arguments from this paper by Audrey Carreau and others all the way from 2009, which is really oriented towards ecologists, that they should deal carefully with the multiplicity and indeterminacy of possible futures, predicting what is predictable and exploring various possibilities when predictions are impossible. And really one of the key ideas here for improving communication with end users is transparency about assumptions that go into developing future ecological projections. When we're predicting what the future might look like, kind of the simplest empirical method is to relate some biotic response to some climate predictor or set of predictors, and then assess what that response might look like under an altered set of climate conditions. However, the predictions we get from these types of correlative methods are really sensitive to the types of empirical data used. Where one method involves relating biotic variation to interannual climate variation using observational time series data, which is often limited by the availability of those data and the narrow range of variability that they represent, and typically involves extrapolation to future time horizons. Whereas alternatively, space for time substitutions take advantage of biotic variation across spatial climatic gradients and translate this spatial variation to time, assuming that current species distributions and communities are in equilibrium with climate and predicting future equilibrium responses, assumptions which may or may not be valid. And this comes in a lot into the thinking about how we use species distribution models and similar approaches. And while both methods have value and certainly don't encompass the entirety of ways that we develop future projections under climate change, they're commonly used and have differing underlying assumptions and can give different answers, really underscoring the importance of clear communication and some shared literacy with end users. For these types of projections to be used in kind of appropriate ways to inform decision-making about natural resource management. And I would argue, in fact, that each approach alone is insufficient to capture realistic expectations over intermediate timescales of years to decades relevant to management, where we really need to be taking scenario-based tack using multiple types of approaches, assumptions, or methodologies to provide those types of future projections for climate adaptation planning. And so broadly speaking, work in global change ecology that's oriented towards providing ecological futures information to inform decision-making could be made more impactful by embracing this scenario thinking more explicitly. Traditional modeling paradigms emphasize kind of most likely outcomes represented in this panel A and B here from this paper in 2016 by Meyer et al. Whereas scenario-based modeling in panels C and D really represents a conceptual shift towards exploring multiple plausible futures under distinct assumptions about boundary conditions, whether that's multiple climate futures, different scenarios of societal changes or shifts in human activities or other drivers, as well as potentially distinct modeling approaches representing different assumptions about how systems work. And so there's lots of opportunities here to kind of explore these what if scenarios through the types of modeling that we already do to develop scenario friendly future projections. And while this discussion is mostly focused around ecological modeling and information, I'll just note that the use of scenarios is not exclusive to this context. Really, it emerged originally in corporate and military planning. And this type of conceptual shift towards exploring multiple futures can be applied broadly in environmental data science to facilitate applications in management planning. We already do this through the use of different SSPs or emissions pathways, and this is really just an argument to consider other sources of uncertainty more carefully, where distinct and divergent storylines or alternate futures can really help hedge bets against uncertainty in making these types of critical decisions. And so this is kind of a lot in the conceptual realm. This is work that's ongoing and in progress. Again, as I mentioned, we're collaborating with folks in the Nebraska Sandhills with managers on the ground to kind of test out and refine this ecological scenarios approach through a more applied case study. So stay tuned for results from that. And to just kind of wrap out here, I want to end off with some key future questions and potential opportunities for collaboration. Where one of the questions that has kind of come from this is how can existing ecological theory, data, and models, including paleoecological research, remote sensing data, et cetera, be leveraged alongside other sources of information, such as local and indigenous knowledges, to explore plausible ecological responses under global change. What are the types of research that are most needed to reduce uncertainty in ecological responses to climate change on management relevant timescales? For example, understanding lags, event-driven dynamics, feedbacks, and contingencies in ecological systems. And lastly, just how can the research community best work with and for managers on the ground to support climate adaptation planning through actionable long-range ecological projections and scenarios. And some ways I think there might be some collaboration here on these methodologies for exploring ecological scenarios are really understanding environmental change in the recent past and how ecological systems have responded to past stressors or recent shifts in climate activity recent shifts in climate, which is a big source of uncertainty. And we have so much data now to bring to bear on these questions through remote sensing and other kind of sources that I know many of you all in Earth Lab are working on. Additionally, I've mostly focused here on uses of empirical data, where process models have their own challenges in terms of running at the appropriate scales and having kind of baked in assumptions that can be challenging to communicate. But I would be really interested in exploring how mechanistic, ecosystem, and demographic models could similarly help contribute to these adaptation planning processes and decisions. And with that, I'd like to thank, all of the many people who've been involved in this work, including my former lab mates, and then also our eco-scenarios working group here, as well as USGS and NSF for funding. And with that, I will take questions.
So how do you not overwhelm everybody with, if you have end users and you say, we don't know, like our predictions are so divergent?
Yeah, so I didn't talk about that too much, but part of scenario planning is the goal of kind of synthesizing that divergence into, you know, maybe 3 to 5 distinct, clearly summarized storylines of change. And so what that would look like in terms of working with managers is kind of taking each of those scenarios and going through what the management implications would be, and using that to kind of evaluate whether current objectives are in line with future conditions and what types of creative strategies might be needed under that range of futures. And so it's really about kind of taking that divergence and condensing it down into a way that's a little bit more kind of tractable to consider. And storylines can be a really powerful method for that in terms of communication, rather than simply just kind of presenting a whole range of future projections, which, yeah, as you said, could be really overwhelming and could kind of undermine planning processes. Yeah, I see someone online has a hand up.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for the presentation. It's super interesting. I'm wondering if there's a way to quantify the possibility of each trajectory, like which one is the most likely one and which one is the less likely one, so that I can provide more information for the actionable plan.
Yeah, that's a great question. That's another thing that's often something that managers want, right? Is probabilities to make decisions around. Kind of the philosophy of scenario planning runs a little bit counter to that, in that the goal is to kind of distinguish plausible from implausible and leave it at that. Because in practice, what folks have found is that if there are probabilities attached, then it's so tempting just to ignore everything but the most likely one. Where if some of these other possibilities are still kind of within the realm of what could happen, it's useful to plan for them, because often the consequences can be quite high. Right. And we're already starting to see that in certain situations where there are unexpected events that are happening that are really challenging management. One example, actually from someone in the audience, thanks, Gregor, is at Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks. There was recently an event of host switching of bark beetles onto species that weren't expected to be vulnerable in the past. And that was something that folks actually anticipated through a prior scenario planning workshop, and were able to plan around a little bit, even though that was a pretty sort of surprising or kind of extreme climate change impact that happened in that system. And so, yeah, it just to kind of work around, I guess, human psychology that really wants to focus on the most likely scenario planning just takes a little step back and is like, no, we should consider everything. Although certainly probabilities are appropriate in some situations when they can be well quantified, and I'm not saying that's not useful, but just in this context, that's kind of the philosophy.
I see. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Gregor?
Yeah, thanks. Great presentation. I just had sort of a question more about your career arc in a way, just to invite you to reflect on it.
Oh, sorry, Gregor. I'm having a little hard time hearing you. I don't know if you could.
Let me try
I
checking
hear
that.
as well. I think it's cutting out a bit.
check.
That's a little better.
Okay, I'll just speak slowly and briefly. Just curious about your starting out in paleoecology, and did you see yourself at that time doing work that was so sort of in so many ways making contact with applied work, and kind of what your arc was from where you started and where you ended up? If you could just share a little bit about that, because it's an amazing synthesis, and a lot of those things are points I've been interested in. Obviously, I work with you. But yeah, just to give a sense for, where you imagine yourself being there. Is this on the track you imagined, or what's happened?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Yeah, if folks didn't catch that, it's a question about kind of my path and arc from kind of moving from paleoecology into this applied work, and whether that was something I anticipated. I guess the short answer is not really. I sort of envisioned more of a focus on kind of that empirical paleoecological work, but I think the further I got in it, the more I got interested in sort of the applied implications and kind of how basic ecological research can really provide information that's useful in the real world, and especially within the context of climate change. And I really do, I'm a bit of an evangelist in terms of advocating for the value of paleoecological work in terms of providing that long-term perspective that I think is often missing when we're just looking at short-term data sets of the past few decades, that it provides kind of both this perspective on how much resilience there is in natural ecological systems, and how past changes have both past changes in environmental drivers have led both to resilience and to large-scale transformations. And so it provides a really unique perspective in that way. And I think that sort of focus around ecological resilience and transformation was sort of a natural lead-in to thinking about some of this more applied work. And partly that was just that there was an opportunity with the CASC at Series to kind of join. The lab I was in at Montana had some connections to the CASC, and I had some other kind of applied components to my dissertation as well that I didn't talk about. But it just seemed like kind of a natural fit, and I'm really enjoying thinking more in this world of climate adaptation and science support for that. So a bit of a roundabout answer. Sorry about that.
Yeah. I think we're right at about time here. Thank you, Kyra.
Yeah, thanks. Hopefully that wasn't too long. Yeah, thanks so much for having me. And please feel free to reach out. I'm findable through Series if there are follow-up questions or other interest in our work in the CASC.
Thank you.